A game you'd have to de-force yourself to play, it's Super NES Works episode 28. Asmik's D-Force makes for a fascinating case study in bad game design for the exact opposite reasons as Home Alone, where Imagineering did basically nothing to take advantage of the Super NES hardware's potential besides include some pretty decent sampled renditions of John Williams' movie theme and some traditional holiday tunes. D-Force attempts to show off the Super NES's unique capabilities, but crashes and burns in the process. Like THQ, Asmik didn't seem to do a lot of its own development, and D-Force is no exception. However, the credit, or blame, for D-Force varies according to your online sources. Some sources list D-Force as a project by ISCO, Intelligent Systems Corporation, not to be mistaken for Nintendo's second-party studio Intelligent Systems. These were the people behind such disaster pieces as Transformers Convoy no Nazo for Famicom. Other sources, including the always reliable Game Developers Research Institute, have it down as a project by a studio called Cream. It's possible both of these answers are correct, as according to Sega 16, ISCO was known to have dealt mostly with game development by subcontracting it out to other studios. Which means it could have been a situation where Asmik hired ISCO, who then hired Cream, who then made all of our lives a little worse by turning in this. D-Force might be the worst and most generic shooter ever released for Super NES. It's a game that has flown beneath the radar, lacking the legacy of a Gradius 3 or the weird-ass box art of an Earth Defense Force. And there's a reason for its anonymity: it's terrible. But despite being a wretched and joyless abomination to play, at least you can't really accuse its creators, whoever they were, of being unambitious. However, the potential connection to Convoy no Nazo makes a tidy sort of sense. That too was a god-awful excuse for a shooter, and it also was built around a clever concept, transforming robots, that made the whole thing vastly less fun to play. In the case of D-Force, we have two fundamental problems. First, there's the craft you control. D-Force takes the form of a top-down vertical shooter in which you control an attack helicopter, reminiscent of the Sea Cobra chopper in use by the American military throughout the 80s. A chopper-based shooter doesn't have to be bad. Toaplan's Tiger Heli was pretty fun, at least in arcades. This one, however, sucks. A big part of the problem comes from the fact that your chopper has an incredibly awkward hitbox. It's extremely narrow along the horizontal axis and incredibly wide along the vertical. This makes sense for a helicopter, sure, but it's not fun in practice. The screen tends to be filled with bullets much of the time, often fired at you from the side, and trying to squeeze the bulky chopper through these fields of fire can be incredibly hard. The one saving grace here, I guess, is that there's so much slowdown here it makes Gradius 3 look like it's running in turbo mode. Once even a handful of enemies and projectiles appear, the entire game chugs to about half speed, which does make avoiding obstacles easier. Or it would if the game performed better in other respects. D-Force has some of the choppiest movement and sprite animation of any game we've seen in VideoWorks since Micronix's take on 1942 for NES. As in that game, both your ship and enemies tend to update their screen position every few frames rather than every frame, which causes them to sort of jump from place to place. It really becomes noticeable when the action grinds into slow motion and the enemy leaps a few positions instantaneously to crash into your ship. The action here is extraordinarily brain-dead. Your chopper has a single power-up path. Collect purple icons to boost your main guns and green icons to add and upgrade seeker missiles. There are no alternate weapons, no choice in specialization or tactics. Granted, Darius' twin also kind of worked like this, but it feels hollow and boring here in a way that Darius never does. Worse, a fully upgraded chopper's projectiles alone grind the frame rate to a halt. Great stuff. The cumbersome controls and dull weapon system don't pair well with the overall level design, which emphasizes lengthy and tedious stages. Even with your lives maxed out and the difficulty set to easy, it's difficult to reach the end of many stages because they just keep going on and on and on. Given Micronic's approach to Ikari Warriors for NES, we can say that maybe Japanese developers who made bad games were at least nice enough to give you a whole lot of those bad games, for whatever that's worth. But where the game really kicks you in the teeth are with the even-numbered stages, where someone decided to harness the Super NES's iconic Mode 7 feature and single-handedly ruined Christmas or Hanukkah for every child who tragically received this game at launch. Here we get to the feature that gave the game its title. D-Force was called Dimension Force in Japan, and it's also proof that whoever developed this game just threw a bunch of random ideas and hoped it all worked. Where the odd number stages of D-Force take the form of a fairly standard modern military action game set against tanks and airplanes, the even number stages get weird. is a little like Time Pilot in that you travel into strange fantasy settings. First prehistoric times, then ancient Greece, then some far future technoscape. These stages are as short as they are out of place, fortunately. But even though they're brief, they're just as painful as the overly lengthy standard stages. These stages allow players to raise and lower their altitude with the use of the controller's shoulder buttons, zooming in and out of the scenery with a Mode 7 effect. It's awful. When you zoom in, the background scenery gets blown up into huge indistinct pixels, which still have collision detection on them. Trying to maneuver around chunky and poorly defined background objects combined with the unfriendly hitbox of your chopper is the worst. The idea here is to alter your altitude in order to avoid obstacles and enemies, or to take out threats in a different vertical plane. But these stages are garbage. Some enemies fail to give you any indication that they're taking damage, and there's no way to know if you're directly below a hazard while you're flying low, which means you can very easily ascend directly into some unseen projectile or monster and die instantly. The bosses here feel half-baked too. Consider the dinosaur that just sits there swinging its tail at you, an attack you can completely avoid by sitting in the corner and shooting the damn thing in the face. Or the twin-headed Cerberus that fires projectiles straight ahead, meaning your chopper's narrow profile allows you to sit motionless and fire into its face. It's all just completely amateurish. Seemingly aware that these two different shooting formats make for a painfully incongruous work, the developer allows players to pick one or the other exclusively if you want. The shooting mode option focuses on just the odd-numbered levels, while the exploration mode sends you through the weird, even-number stages. But even this option sucks. Enemies in exploration mode never drop weapon power-ups, so you have to complete that mode with your default weapon, which becomes almost impossibly hard in the future-based stage. D-Force, in short, is extraordinarily terrible. This game would have been lackluster years earlier on 8-bit hardware, and coming after several quite solid shooters on Super NES, it's an embarrassment. Even the theoretically impressive Mode 7 feature detracts from the experience. In short, the D in D-Force does not stand for Dimension. It stands for Do Not Ever Play This. Next on Super NES Works, we wrap up 1991 with a generally mediocre action RPG that, by comparison to D-Force and Home Alone, will appear to be a tremendous masterpiece.